All right, how's it going? It's been a while. Turns out I can't really go without talking about history. I'm shouting out the windows at people. So I figure I'll do a little recording here. We'll go through some of these notes. If it helps, maybe we'll do more. If it doesn't help, I might do more anyway. No, who knows, right? So you guys should have these written down. I'm just going to skim a couple highlights here that I want to touch on. So when we last left off, we had Pearl Harbor, right? Bad stuff, Japanese attack on the Hawaiian naval port. And at first, the immediate reaction to this, the U.S. Navy was kind of too disorganized at the time. We're reeling from this attack. We weren't able to instantly respond. And so Japan uses that opportunity to quickly expand over the Pacific Ocean. So you have this Japanese empire expanding. A bunch of minor allied forces in the area are defeated. They take the Philippines from us. Things are looking bad, right? Specifically in the Philippines, Douglas MacArthur, one of the most dangerous men in America, remember, according to FDR, very powerful military commander, is forced to abandon the Philippines. We lose tens of thousands of soldiers. They are sent on essentially a death march, the Bataan Death March, 63 miles to prison camps. A lot of Americans and Filipinos there die. That's not Filipinos not misspelled. Filipino spelled with an F. The Philippines spelled with PH. Ask English teachers. I don't know. Pretty rough stuff. This is a nice photograph from this. There's a lot of horrifying photographs from the death march. You have soldiers who are emaciated, right? Like concentration camp pictures. You have people who are starving. Soldiers are killed on this march. They're tortured. Not a great treatment of prisoners of war, right? Seen as a pretty horrifying thing to most Americans. People are shocked when this kind of stuff comes out. Also, highlighting how codes were broken. We talked about this before, but in case you forgot, every sort of country in World War II had their own sort of code system. So you have, with the Japanese, they used book ciphers. And what that means is like they would have a specific book people would use, and you would use page numbers and number of the words in the book to reflect the code you're trying to convey. So like the fourth word in your book is like going, and you want to have them attack somewhere. Like, the army's going here. For the word going, you would say page, 3, word 4. And they would all have the same copy of that book, and they'd be able to cipher together the message, right? Those systems work pretty well. Yeah, there's some things you have to take into account, right? Everyone has to have the same book. Everyone has to be on the same page, literally, for that sort of thing. So, that sort of plays a role in how they could get messages across. We broke the code. We were able to find the books they were using, and so we were able to decipher what the Japanese were planning at times. Germany used number-based numerical machine codes. You've heard about the Enigma device. To simplify, it's basically like a typewriter where like the letter A is actually 4 letters after. Like there's a number for each letter that corresponds to what's actually typed. So when you type a sentence, it comes out as gibberish. But if you have the code, you can decode that gibberish back to its original format. Those kind of codes are harder to break than book ciphers. You have to kind of have the machine to break it, otherwise they can change the code on like a daily basis. But the American code is probably the most unique. So what we ended up using is the Navajo Indians. Their language was a very unique Native American language. People didn't necessarily have other countries didn't have access to that kind of knowledge that we did. So the Navajo code talkers became hugely important for the United States. These Native Americans were able to encode and deliver our messages and get things to troops. And it's a very difficult language to understand if you don't have an Indian there to sort of teach it to you, a Navajo Indian. Then it's nearly impossible. The way they describe things, a very unique sort of language, played a huge role in the Pacific campaign for the United States. Which, remember, that's the campaign we fought, the majority of with very little assistance, right? There are some major naval battles there. That movie that just came out last year, Midway, talked about sort of our response to, this Japanese presence in the Pacific. These are all battles that the Japanese expected they wouldn't have had to fight, right? The idea under Pearl Harbor was that they're going to go in and severely cripple our naval power so that this wouldn't have happened, right? But these are some major battles. They play a pretty big role. In terms of when it comes to like taking back territory, there's, by the way, a great TV show called The Pacific that talks about the Pacific Campaign. It's sort of a spin-off of the guy who made Band of Brothers, which talks about the European side of the American campaign during World War II. It's good, a little violent, get some parental permission. But one of the big things you run into in the Pacific Campaign is the Japanese military calling back on that like Bushido, that samurai like armor from sort of medieval times. This idea of like fighting to the death, right? You're dealing with people who, when their planes were unable to, make it back, they were okay with, suicide bombing, kamikaze piloting their planes into ships, right? These are people who are going to fight, to the extreme. And that means every single island that the U.S. comes across, every area where the Japanese soldiers, becomes a much more dangerous fight. Certainly like an elongated struggle, a lot of death, a lot of every inch of ground takes a lot of fighting. And that's sort of a scary idea, right? These are people who feel very strong. You obviously have to feel very strongly in a cause if you're going to fight to the death, right? Just the environment in these jungles is bad. You have a lot of transmission of diseases, a lot of mosquitoes, bloodborne illnesses. The rain in these jungles caused a lot of military equipment to not function as well. You can imagine driving a big, giant, heavy tank through mud is not the easiest thing, right? It made supplies very difficult to transport, across the Pacific. And that's not just, when they're talking about naval transportation, like on boats. It's once you get to the islands, that's where the real issue is. There's a lot of misconceptions of how fighting in the Pacific went. I mean, I have friends who are under the understanding that the soldiers just went back to their boats at night. That doesn't happen. You're camping out in the jungle, right? You're dealing with the threat of constant attacks. It's very similar to a war we'll talk about later, Vietnam, right? Where you're in very, dangerous situations like that. And the supplies being hard to move means that you're kind of always on a clock, right? It doesn't matter how hard you fight. If your soldiers don't have food, if they don't have enough bullets, these are things that are going to end your struggle a little earlier. The strategy you'll hear a lot about the Pacific Campaign is island hopping. This map's very simplified. There are hundreds of tiny little islands across the Pacific Ocean. And the U.S. military decides to focus only on essential islands. Go around some of those smaller islands that have no military importance. That helps them in some ways. It saves you a lot of soldiers' lives and things. But then you also have like these weird situations where there are islands in the Pacific that by the time Japan surrenders, they never received information that Japan had surrendered. They've just been waiting on their island to fight people and, don't find out till long after the war was over, right? It's because the U.S. military just went around them. These are islands that we didn't need. So focusing on ones that are strategically important. Each battle is hard fought. Eventually, we get all the way out to the Philippines. We recapture the Philippines. But there starts to be talk of what is it going to look like when we get closer to Japan. Because as these people are fighting, tooth and nail, each island, there's concerns that, taking the actual island of Japan might be a necessity. They might not surrender. And estimates were coming in internally in the U.S. military that these are going to be massive numbers of casualties, right? Massive loss of life. Each Japanese citizen, if they grab kitchen utensils and fight back, causes a problem, right? And so one of the solutions was to launch bombing runs. So similar to how the Germans were bombing people in London, the United States decides to launch bombing runs on Japanese cities. So over 60 cities are targeted. There are fire bombings, which are really devastating. You can see sort of the aftermath in that picture there, the scorched earth literally from these bombs. The scary thing about these bombing runs is this is where we get into questionable territory over like who's the good guy, bad guy here, right? Because we're not necessarily bombing strictly military sites, as you can see from that picture, right? If you consider every Japanese citizen as a possible threat, then under that logic, the U.S. government said, if we got to bomb civilian areas to promote surrender, then maybe that's what we have to do, right? One of these Tokyo fire bombings leaves 1 million Japanese people homeless. I mean, that's a massive toll on the Japanese economy, right? That's a massive damage Loss of life, that kind of thing is huge. And despite all these bombing runs, these 60 cities being attacked, and millions of dollars of bombs and explosives being dropped on them, there's still no sign of Japan surrendering, and that is what got really sort of scary for the American military, right? Because you're willing to bomb these cities to the point where they look like they're literally burnt, and they're still willing to fight back, right? Iwo Jima and Okinawa, two of the islands close to Japan, are some of the final islands we take before we get to the main, actual country of Japan. And these were massively large battles, lasted a long time. This is where the famous photograph comes from, pictured there, of soldiers mounting the flag. This is huge. American to Japanese casualties, 1 wounded or dead American for every 10 wounded or dead Japanese. Those are still big numbers for Americans. These are costly battles. In terms of loss of life, let's see. 26,000 Americans casualties, 6,800 dead in Iwo Jima, which was a 36-day battle. 82-day battle in Okinawa resulted in 62,000 casualties, 12,000 killed or missing. Those are startlingly big numbers for these relatively small islands. And there's a lot of talk within the U.S. military. What's going to be the solution? What do we do to tackle this Japanese problem? And the atomic bomb is going to be a big factor there, right? You have this idea of they're planning for this invasion. We had ideas that there's going to be, a lot of very serious sort of results to that in terms of what do you do when you have to fight street to street, right? And that's where the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb is going to come in. This idea of maybe there's a way we can do it while preserving American loss of life. Although some historians would debate how rough this might have been. There are some theories out there that say that Japan might not have been as difficult of a conquest as we expect, but we'll never know. Right? Different things happen. There's some vocab. On the German front, you have sort of this rapidly collapsing front in Europe. You have Hitler, who drafts anyone from 16 to 60 into the army towards the end of the war. That's a huge range, right? So you have these young kids who are now enlisting, but you also have these veterans, these elderly people. And there is a brief moment where it looked like Germany was going to make a comeback. The Battle of the Bulge, it's called the Bulge because the Western Front literally bulges outward with this surge of German soldiers, and they push forces back 65 miles over the land. They push them back out away from Germany. Right, looks like it's going to be successful, but it very quickly loses steam. There's also combined with a particularly rough winter sort of weather, and the Allied forces were able to push back the Germans again. And as the German army starts to collapse, they begin bombing runs on German cities, and there is a race between the United States and sort of the Soviet Union as to who's going to get to Berlin. And it's interesting in some ways because you've got both sides kind of want the prestige of bringing down Hitler, right, of ending this war. The Russians end up winning. The Soviet Union beats us to Berlin. They're the first to get there. Hitler, of course, commits suicide, refuses to be caught, right? But an interesting sort of side note in terms of the Soviet Union, I believe the general who was famous for taking Berlin for the Soviet Union ended up being sent to one of Stalin's death camps at a later date, because you can't have a guy who's going to be more famous than you, so you got to get him out of the picture, right? But this is the end of part of that war, right? This war is over, but for the United States, we're still dealing with the Pacific Campaign at the same time, right? So while this part of the war is over, World War II itself not completely over, which is why they call it VE Day, Victory in Europe. But there's a really big part of the aftermath we haven't touched on. And that's the Holocaust, right? You've had this massive amount of imprisoned citizens, right? Jewish people, gypsies, disabled, gays, people who fall under these undesirables in Germany, get put in these camps where they had lost their citizenship, their property, and over time these camps got worse. So the concentration camps weren't immediately like camps they just sent people to die in. That was something that developed over the course of the war, right? This idea of like, what are they going to do with these prisoners? And some of that is for like practical reasons. Economically, it's the idea of like, it's very expensive to feed these prisoners. You can see they're all starving for a reason, right? And so the idea was like they began exterminating them as a means of one, saving money for these governments, but two, this idea that like Hitler didn't want these people to be able to create more of them, right? This idea of like eugenics, right? This idea they practiced in the Nazi Party of like genetic purity. This idea like sick people is something that they passed down in their genes. They believed, right? The Holocaust is also made worse in a way, partially like 1% worse in the fact that as Allied forces pushed in to German areas, we disrupted supply lines, right? And if you're running low on food, you're going to feed your soldiers first, you're going to feed the prisoners first. I mean, that's pretty obvious what's going to happen, right? These people are starved to even further extremes. Estimates put over 6 million Jewish people died over the course of the Holocaust. Pretty horrific stuff. There are some Germans that had no idea, how bad things got in these camps. You hear about this idea called the final solution, right? This genocide of the Jewish people. These people are put in gas chambers. Their bodies are burned, right? They're cremated. There's these mass executions at these labor camps as a way to get rid of these people. And they show after the war, when a bunch of these Nazi soldiers are put on trial, they show some of them footage and like photographs of what was happening in these camps. And some people who were huge supporters of the Nazi Party had no idea what was happening, and were sort of horrified. Now, whether or not they're sort of acting or they actually were, that depends, right? But there are definitely people who had no idea of the extremes that were happening at these camps. And then there are some, scarier part, there are some that had absolutely an understanding of what was happening and were in full support of it, right? One of the scary things to remember about the Nazi Party in general, the big lesson history has for that, is that those were not people who are necessarily like cartoon villains, right? They're just normal people following rules and things that they believed in because they're convinced of it, right? And that's the scary thing. Some of these people supported this because they thought they were doing the right thing. Again, shocking to us, but if you're in those people's shoes, who knows, right? You're talking about a very different time period. People were easily convinced of some pretty extreme things. The Manhattan Project, as I said, nuclear weapons, right? They tested in the New Mexico desert. There's some really terrifying stuff when you read about the extremes of this project. You have explosives that were not really up to par. So we didn't have a lot of these. When we first made the atomic bomb, we only had a couple of them. The actual first bomb tested in New Mexico was held together by duct tape. So think about that. Bomb wasn't even fully complete. They drop it, they tested it. Huge, massive explosion. They decide this might be something we can use, right, to end the war with Japan without having to send in American troops, right? Drop these bombs on them. That might save us some lives. There are some scary ideas. So when they came to like dropping these bombs, they had to decide where they wanted to drop them. And there was a concern that the bombs weren't going to explode. So they weren't 100% sure they were going to blow up. So we had to choose cities that were located on the shores, near the ocean, so we could retrieve the bomb if something was wrong. So the last thing you want to do is have the bomb not go off, and now the Japanese have an atomic bomb to study and figure out, right? So when they chose Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they chose these cities geographically, but also because they wanted to choose cities that were going to cripple Japan's economy. But they don't pick Tokyo, right? They don't actually pick the capital. So, like I said, they're targeting coastal cities. They request an unconditional surrender, right? This idea of like you can't name the terms of your surrender. Japanese refuse, and they drop a bomb on Hiroshima, killing over 80,000 people, right? Massively destructive, bomb never been seen before in terms of warfare. Japanese people are pretty shocked by this. There were some rumors that they were in the process of surrendering, right? There are some historians who have made the argument that if we gave them like a week or so, they might have surrendered right here. We don't give them a week. We give them 3 days. Then we drop another one. Now, this one's on Nagasaki. 1/3 of the city's wiped out. Japan surrenders, shortly after this. But like I said, there's some debate here in terms of like, was it necessary to drop the second one? Or, you can't really say for sure, right? You could make the argument that you needed to drop more than one to prove that that wasn't just a one-time thing, that you had more of these bombs. We had, I believe, 4. So we had 2 other ones that we could have used if we needed to, but it wasn't like we had hundreds, right? Today we have a lot, but these were very early on. And the Japanese government has no answer to this, right? They're forced to surrender. There are some absolutely horrifying stories that come about as a result of these bombs being dropped. They're like first-hand accounts. The doctors who were working in Japanese hospitals when these bombs hit recorded their experiences, and they are the only first-hand accounts of surviving, nuclear, attacks that are in history, because it never happened after that, right? And there are some really gross ones. I mean, there's one of a guy who he went into a bathroom when the bomb hit, and it was a bathroom that didn't have windows, and he comes out and it's like the Twilight Zone, like everything's changed. There are things that are, all the glass has been blown out of the windows. He talks about going out and like, picking this guy sitting on the stairs, like holding his head in his hands, and he grabs his arm to like pick him up, and the skin comes off his arm for the nuclear radiation. I mean, that sounds pretty horrifying, right? I mean, this is a very devastating piece of technology. These doctors recorded the experience of dealing with people with these severe radiation burns, and there's all sorts of really gross pictures that come out of this of people dying, right? Because radiation death is horrible. Your inside your body liquefies, or you like drown in your own blood. It's gross, right? If you don't die immediately in an explosion, it's almost worse. There was a guy, can't remember the name that they gave him. He gave him a special title. He survived both attacks. He was in Hiroshima when the bomb dropped, and then he went to Nagasaki and the bomb dropped there too. So he actually was in both of them, which is, the fact that he didn't die from them, I guess, is lucky. So he can be considered lucky in that way. I don't know if I'd call myself lucky for, being involved in 2 explosions, but you got that going on. Coming to the end of this World War II, though, after Japan's surrender, we have to look at the sort of numbers in this. You have a huge amount of people who were killed worldwide. Over half of that were civilians. So over half of the people killed were not part of the military. I mean, that's a scary thing to think about. If you look on here, the Soviet Union has a massive amount of civilian and military deaths. The blue line here is a percentage of population. So Poland actually lost a huge percent of their population, close to 18% or so. But the Soviet Union takes massive numbers. They take the brunt of that war, which is why when we talk about the Cold War after this, right, that negative feeling between the Soviet Union and the United States is partially because they feel like they took on the majority of the cost of this war, but they didn't necessarily get a majority of the recognition, fame, rewards in a way. I mean, you have the United States gets the atomic bomb. We don't share it with the Soviet Union. We keep it, right? We don't share those plans at first anyway. Eventually some people are going to leak those plans, but we're not exactly signing up to tell everybody how to make this thing. National economies are in ruin. There are millions of people left without food and shelter. It's bad stuff, right? The Yalta Conference, where FDR, Churchill, Stalin meet, they decide to, what are they going to do in this post-war Europe? They're going to discuss, handling of the country following this. You have a change of leadership, though, right? Because the Yalta Conference, FDR was still alive, but by the end of this war, he's dead, right? And you have Truman, who takes office, who's vice president, right? About 4 months before the dropping of the atomic bomb is when President Truman, becomes the president, and he's told, hey, we have this, weapon, this extremely powerful weapon, and he has to decide, it's up to him whether or not that thing got dropped, right? And so he's the guy who in some ways is the most important person in the world at the time, right? Because he's the guy who his country has the atomic bomb. But in other ways, he's seen as like inexperienced. He's meeting with people like Stalin and Churchill who had been in this war from the start, and they sort of saw Truman as like this new guy, right? This guy who's relatively young to this war thing, and in that way, it sort of he talks about his difficulties with sort of getting along with these people at times and the way that they had treated him, right? But again, this is a guy who, depending on whether or not you agree, should use the atomic bomb is either a very heroic figure in American history, or he's a guy who got a lot of civilians killed. You can kind of argue that either way. They decide in one of these leadership meetings to divide not only Germany but the actual city of Berlin. So the majority of like a good chunk of Germany is going to be sort of absorbed into the Soviet Union, Russia. But the actual city of Berlin, we're going to divide into 4 areas. So France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The French, British, and American sector kind of just become West Berlin. They kind of all meld together. And East Berlin stays Soviet. And that is going to come back around later during the Cold War as a problem, right? Because you've got like these communists and these capitalist people living right next to each other, very different ways of life. Leads to some minor issues, right? Certainly there's going to be at one point there's going to literally be a wall that divides East and West Berlin, and it's a whole ordeal. We'll get to it. So Japanese reconstruction, though, it's interesting because a lot of people in America go either way on this. There are some people who are pushing for just punish the Japanese people, and there are others who are saying there's an opportunity to create a strong ally in the Asian region, right? And it's interesting, and people always ask whenever I teach this, they're always very confused. Like, we dropped the atomic bomb, 2 of them, on Japan, but we end up today being very close allies. And that's because while there was some punishment that's done to Japan, and we'll get to it in a second, the Americans work very hard to revive and rebuild Japan. Now, it's not the same Japan. We rebuild it in the image that we would like it to be rebuilt in, right? We come in and we basically force them to change towards democracy and capitalist ideas. We spend a lot of money over the process of rebuilding it. We oversee the creation of a new government there, and the rounding up of the old government for wartime punishments. And at the end of it, the end result is actually very successful in a way of yes, we do help rebuild Japan, get them back on their feet, and they do become a very strong ally of ours, right? In a lot of ways, it's partially because of the same problems they had before they're our enemy, right? They're still very dependent on trade. Being a tiny island country, they still need that. So that's going to still play a role there. But it is something that MacArthur and people led, working towards, right? And there are still some people that say, this is some pretty heavy-handed reconstruction. We kind of did, whatever we wanted to do. Oh boy. Unit 731. Some messed up stuff. Like I told you guys in the classroom, you can look this up if you want. It's kind of horrifying. There were some pretty shocking things. So they were messing around with biological warfare. Biological warfare means using, diseases as weapons. Unit 731 was a Japanese research unit that experimented with the Black Death. They had fleas that they had infected with the plague, and they had dropped them on Chinese cities during the war. So they purposely infected Chinese cities with literally the bubonic plague. They had planned a biological attack on San Diego. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was a planned attack to attack western coast American cities with biological weapons, right? Had that been successful, had that attack launched, that would have been, really bad. Now, would that have lost us the war or anything? Maybe not, but it would have had a huge loss of life. We're talking epidemics of, massive proportions of disease wiping through portions of U.S. cities. That'd be real bad. There's some really horrifying stories from these medical experiments. They tortured people. They practiced vivisection, cutting people open, examining organs. There's gruesome ones of taking out your stomach and attaching your throat to your intestines, and then they starved to death, and they documented all. They practiced experimenting with frostbite, purposely freezing people's limbs and recording the evidence, removing arms and legs. I mean, it's super gross stuff. You can read all about it if you want on your own. It's disgusting, right? Horrifying stuff. And despite all that, this unit their information comes out. The U.S. gathers up all the stuff they did, and we grant them immunity, which is one of the most shocking things, I think, as a result of this war. This is not super publicized at the time, right? But in exchange for their data on biological weapons and experiments on people, they actually grant immunity to the people who are part of this unit. So the people who tortured and murdered and did horrible things to these Chinese citizens and prisoners of war are actually granted immunity. They are found innocent. They can't be tried for this crime, right? And the logic was the U.S. government wanted the biological weapons program. We wanted to use that data. We wanted to have ways to figure out how we would respond to it for protection, right? But also maybe for weapons. We don't know, right? And when victims came out and talked about this, the U.S. government and the new Japanese government dismissed this as communist propaganda. They just lied to people and said it didn't happen. There wasn't a Unit 731. We know nowadays there was Unit 731. They did pretty awful stuff, but we were willing to overlook that because, we wanted that information. We found that to be useful for us, defensively, medically. I mean, probably one of the worst things done at the end of this war, right? Really quickly, how long am I going here? Time flies, 30 minutes. Really quickly, the forming of Israel. Jewish people have been moving into Palestine since World War I, right? This area has been an area where they were already coming in. 1948, they decided to create this new country of Israel. Turns out all of the neighboring states around them don't agree with that, attack them. Israel defends themselves. It's weird to just think like a country just appears, right? There's like, we're a new country now. You can see, Jerusalem marked on the map here. That's the important city, right? You have to remember that that's a city that is important for Christians, it's important for Jewish people, and it's important for Muslims. And that's why that area is still a contested area today. It's why the city of Jerusalem is shared between Israel and Muslim countries, and you have a lot of sort of tension there, right? It's a very important place spiritually for a lot of people. We recognize them as an independent Jewish state. We will supply them with weapons. They're still a powerful ally of ours today. In the Middle East, they are one of our only oldest allies. They're ones that we can always sort of count on. We can always rely on Israel, but that's also kind of a problem for us. At times that causes some of those other Middle Eastern countries not like us as much because of our found friendship with this country. But you kind of have this new thing coming up, and it's going to be interesting, right? Also, in terms of this idea of like a superpower coming out after this war, the United States massively strong. We took very little war damage. Most of the war was not fought on our soil, with the exception of Pearl Harbor. We have massive new war technology. All this stuff comes along, putting us in a very good position. But the Soviet Union is strengthened in a different way. So the Russians took huge amounts of loss of life, right, and economic damage over this war, but they occupied all these countries and absorbed them and pushed their style of government into these neighboring countries that they're going to sort of strengthen themselves off of that. So at first it looked like just the United States was going to be alone in being a superpower, but that's not what happens. Instead, the Russians appear over here, and you have sort of two incredibly strong, powerful superpowers at the same time, with very different ideological views on how the world should be run. And because of that, it becomes a massive conflict. So the Cold War is sort of this U.S. versus Russia, but it's also like this idea of capitalism and democracy versus like communism, and these different views on how those things should be, taken into account. And that is something that we'll talk about going forward, right? Like, what do you do with that kind of tension? Obviously, the Soviet Union wants access to nuclear weapons. We're not willing to give it to them. That increases the tension. They look at the number of dollars we gave out during the war. We didn't help Soviet Union as much as we helped other countries, and so we'll get to that when we talk about the Cold War. Anyway, it's my 35-minute power through a bunch of notes. This felt weird, but I just felt like talking about it. Hopefully it helps you. If you have any questions, let me know. Make sure you guys are getting your work done. Like I said, if these helped, we can do more. If not, I might still do more. Who knows? I'm just a crazy guy sitting at home playing video games, talking about history. Right? Still rocking Hawaiian shirts, don't worry. Okay? We're not letting the quarantine get us down. Thanks for watching.